Well, good morning, everybody, and a happy new year to you all, both speakers and attendants. So my name is Françoise Nicolas. I'm the director of the Center for Asian Studies here at Ifri, French Institute of International Relations. And we'll be discussing today UK's accession to the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, a hot topic. And for this, we have, I think, an excellent lineup of speakers. But before that, I will explain why we chose to discuss this issue. Almost 1 year ago, the UK submitted its application to join the CPTPP. It came actually as a surprise, since the UK, as everybody knows, is not exactly a Pacific country. So it wasn't an obvious candidate for this partnership. And the submission was received quite positively by the signatories of the partnership. 6 months later, it was accepted. And in September, the negotiation actually started to include or integrate the UK into the CPTPP. So the negotiations are ongoing. Of course, for economists, it came perhaps as a surprise, but it also raised a number of issues, a number of questions. And I think that we can group the questions in three main themes. The first set of questions relates to the UK per se. What is it exactly that the UK is getting at by seeking to join the CPTPP, since, as I said earlier, it is not a Pacific country. So what are the objectives of the UK? What will be the major challenges for the UK in joining this partnership, which is, I guess, as everybody knows, a very ambitious agreement, a broad-ranging, wide-ranging agreement dealing with a number of issues, not only tariff liberalization, but a number of other issues. So what will be the difficulties that the UK will encounter? And also, what will be the impact of this new accession on the agreement itself? So that's a second set of questions. What will be the impact for the agreement and for the signatories of the agreement, in particular Japan, who is chairing the group for the time being? So that is a second set of questions, impact of this new participation on the existing agreement. And then a third set of questions relates to the impact of this enlarged agreement on the rest of the trading system, and in particular on the multilateral trading system. So how does the WTO see that? What will be the impact for the WTO? The WTO is in difficulties these days. It is no longer exactly what it should be. It is no longer the place where the rules are being set. And so there is perhaps some kind of a risk that the CPTPP may to some extent replace the WTO as the forum where the rules for trade are being discussed. So this is a third set of issues that also need to be discussed. So for these three sets of questions, we have gathered, I think, a very interesting lineup of speakers. And in the order of appearance on stage, I will explain who they are. So the first person who will take the floor is Erik van der Marel, who is with the European Center for International Political Economy. I got that right. And he is a well-known expert in trade issues. He is also working with the University in Brussels, the Free University in Brussels, and is consultant economist at the World Bank. So he will be addressing the UK's position and the difficulties and the rationale for the UK joining the partnership. The second in line is Minako MORITA-JAEGER, who is a senior research fellow in international trade in the Department of Economics and policy research fellow at the UK Trade Policy Observatory, both at the University of Sussex, a university that is close to my heart because I spent some time there in my earlier days. So she will be discussing also the UK's position and the Japanese position. And last but not least, Rohini, ACHARYA, who is counselor with the World Trade Organization and chief of the Regional Trade Agreement section in the Trade Policies Review Division at the WTO. She will be discussing precisely the impact of this enlarged partnership on the WTO or on the multilateral trading system, broadly speaking. But I don't want to preempt too much what she's going to say. But if I understand properly, that's more or less the area that she will be covering. So we are now ready to engage in the discussion. And so without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Erik for preliminary or introductory remarks. So the first wave of remarks shouldn't be too long, like 10 minutes or so. And so then there will be an exchange between the three of you, and then we'll open the floor to the rest of the audience. So Erik, the floor is yours for approximately 10 minutes or so.
Yes, thank you very much. So I prepared a couple of slides. I mean, only 2 slides. I know my introductory words should be short. So what I would like to say for those couple of minutes is, how do I look at the UK's accession to the CPTPP from a trade economics perspective? And without being too technical, I would like to explain why my take is why I pose certain questions for the UK's rationale to access the CPTPP. And I do that from a specific perspective, because I think we all know that the UK is a services-driven economy. And so in that sense, I think it's an economy that is, I think, fit for the future, because I think globally what international trade is going towards is precisely that type of trade. I mean, we will see more services trade, more intangible kind of trade going on in the future. And the UK is well positioned in that sense. So, and if you think about the UK's choice to join the CPTPP, I mean, from a sort of a helicopter perspective, it makes sense, I think, at first sight, because a lot of the trade activities will take place in the Asian region. The gravity sort of trade, you know, sort of the trade activity, global trade activity will pivot towards that region in the next sort of 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, there is some research about this, and that has been going on for a while. So in that sense, you could say, I mean, you know, it makes sense for the UK to join this agreement, because that agreement is largely based, of course, in the Pacific there. So in that sense, one of the rationales, if you would sort of go that, like take a step further, is it would like to compensate for the potential losses that the UK is going to incur by leaving the EU market. So, you know, that makes sense in that, so that's a good rationale. And even from a political economy perspective, I mean, you could think like, okay, so if the Asian region is so dynamic, I mean, obviously with the CPTPP, new standards might be set there in the region. And imagine if other, you know, members are going to join the CPTPP, and potentially, you know, it becomes a sort of a central point to negotiate for many countries. And so, you know, what been said in introductory words, I mean, it might be sort of in competition then with the WTO in some ways, or, you know, you could think of, okay, so that is a dynamic region, standards are going to set there. So that's another rationale for the UK to join the CPTPP, because that's where things are going to matter. Also for trade trade and also for digital trade, there's a lot of talk about how, you know, digital trade, and in particular digital services trade, you know, an agreement, a global agreement or agreement with many countries is so much necessary, because that also is the future. So in that sense, I think it makes sense. But at the same time, I think I put a question mark there for those 2 rationales, whether they are really going to work. Because what we do know, and that's my sort of economic argument here, is that even if you look into the trade world of services, digital trade, intangible trade, things that you trade over the internet, gravity, the role of distance still matters, even for an economy like the UK. And so what does that mean? It means that, yes, I mean, one of the big rationales might be that, you know, it wants to compensate for the losses that it has because of Brexit. And it might have new standards applicable with the CPP, and so that would help further you know, to export their services and anything else that the UK exports. I mean, because of the role of distance, because that matters also in services, I think the UK will find a hard time in order to realize those potential gains by joining the CPTPP. And so what is often said is sort of the popular media is that, well, you know, if that's really sort of the case, why is it so easy then to trade all that stuff over the internet? I mean, all what it takes is to press the enter button and we send like a service and that's it, basically. So we can do that basically anywhere in the world. Well, that turns out to be a bit more tricky. I mean, that comes down to a lot of other variables that are associated or other factors that are associated with distance that makes it that the further away you are, the more difficult it becomes to precisely export also these kind of services and intangible stuff that you might otherwise, you know, easily send over the internet. And that has to do with language, it has to do with the similar institutional systems in your country that all facilitates kind of trade and also services trade in which the UK has so much comparative advantage. Now, to summarize that and to go a little bit, you know, further in my argument, in my reasoning, I mean, what I just told you is sort of visible in this picture that you see here on the left side of this slide. I mean, what you see here is the extent to which the UK with a partner country is able to realize its trade potential that is sort of plotted here on the vertical axis. So the straight line here on the left side of that left-hand panel. And then the distance as such is played on the horizontal axis here. And what you do see, the further away for every dot, and every dot is every country, the further away a partner country is from the UK, because the distance is measuring that between the UK and a partner country, the lower the extent to which the UK is precisely trading with a partner country. So the countries here in green are all part of CPTPP. So on average, that level of trade is lower than compared to all the blue dots, which are the countries in the EU market. So that is the first message that, you know, what I just told you, the further away, the more difficult it will become for the UK to trade services and even goods as well with countries that are part of CPTPP, just because they are further away. And what we show in terms of the data, that's really what's going on. But there's something else as well going on. And I think that makes it very interesting and even further an argument for why I'm a bit skeptical for the UK to realize these trade benefits. So if you look closely to that line that you see, what is it, the red dashed line, you see some countries that are placed beyond the red line, and you see some countries that are placed below the red line. And that precisely indicates the potential of the UK that it can reach in terms of export the services to these countries. So a lot of the countries that are slightly bigger and I think slightly more interesting for the UK to send or to export to are Canada, or Australia, or Malaysia, or for example, Japan. These are all countries that are placed beyond that dashed line. Now, what does it mean? It means that actually, in terms of what the UK can reach for trade potential with these countries, has already been sort of realized. So in other words, to put it more sort of straightforward, the UK is already sort of trading a lot with those countries, sort of over trading with those countries already. And that has to do with, you know, similar sort of institutional and contractual settings, similar language, for example, if you think about Canada and Australia, they were part of the Commonwealth. So all the potential that the UK could reach with these countries has already sort of not been exhausted, but, you know, is the UK already realizing. Now, the countries below that dashed line are the countries where the UK can still reach some potential, right? So then you think of Peru, Vietnam, and Mexico. But there, my take is also rather skeptical. You could say, well, okay, there is a market there, you know, for the CPTPP countries, for the UK. So that's what the UK should exploit. And the UK should exploit that and will probably exploit that. But I think that is also somehow limited, because if you think about a country like Vietnam in the region is, for example, very much sort of linked to China. Mexico is a country that is very much linked to North America, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the US, basically. And so my take is, as long as big members are not joining the CPTPP, I mean, of course, Japan has joined, it's part of the CPTPP and is a big market, but if as long as the other two big markets are not joining the CPTPP, I think the trade benefits for the UK will be limited. And that's really where I would like to say that I think also in terms of, you know, the trading system, whether the CPTPP has a dent or really makes a sort of a big sort of dent for the world trading system, I think as long as these two big countries are not joining the CPTPP, it remains limited, and it remains limited particularly for a country like the UK. And so my take is, I mean, you know, it for sure it will set sort of new standards, and for sure it will create new trade. Although the latest sort of analysis that I've seen regarding the trade benefits of the CPTPP is that, yes, there might be some between members, but they are as much as what these members trade outside the CPTPP. And to me, that doesn't come as a surprise, because precisely the big countries haven't joined, and maybe will never join. I don't know, I think China has applied, but you know, the US is abstaining from the CPTPP, have not joined the CPTPP so far. And so therefore, I would say, yeah, that is necessary. And so the question is, one needs to search for a big market, and who is going to be? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Erik. That was extremely clear. Perhaps another factor which actually plays a role in the graph that you just showed is the level of development. So there is culture, absolutely, there is language, but the level of development obviously also has a role to play. Yep. If we look at the countries with which the UK already has quite intense trade in services, well, Canada, Chile is at the lower level, but still it is more developed than the others. New Zealand, Australia, Singapore is quite high on the graph. So obviously the level of development has also something to do with the result that you just showed. So let's now see whether Minako shares your skepticism about the gains that the UK may get from joining the CPTPP. And then we'll also discuss a couple of issues that you raised, Erik, about the other big joining the CPTPP at some point or not. Because as I guess most people know, China has recently also applied to join the CPTPP, to a number of people's surprise. And if you don't think that the UK may gain something out of it, the reason that you may be skeptical with China is that I'm not sure that that China actually qualifies to join the CPTPP, but we'll maybe discussing that later on. So Minako, what's your take on this, on UK and impact of UK's application on Japan and on the CPTPP per se? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Françoise. Can you hear me? Yes, good. Okay. Well, thank you so much for the excellent presentation, Erik, and the opening remarks. I tend to agree with what you said. I'd like to explain the implication for the UK and also Japan from the wider political, international political economy perspective. First of all, what is implication for the UK of joining the CPTPP? So the main rationale for the UK is to join the CPTPP is for the UK, as Erik said, well, joining the CPTPP is a part of its historical geostrategic project. So which is a shift from of its focus from Europe to the Asia-Pacific region. So this is what the UK government's integrated review of security, defense, development, foreign policy calls the Indo-Pacific tilt. The UK government framed the Indo-Pacific tilt as first, economic opportunities, second, geopolitical security, third, sharing core values, such as free trade and diplomacy. So what are the specific UK's major expectation to the CPTPP? So the UK wants to use the CPTPP, as Erik said, the basis for increasing its political presence in the Asia-Pacific region and using the region's economic dynamism for its economic growth. Among these three objectives, I said, as set by the UK government, economic opportunities seem to be the major expectation. So this is because Brexit will reduce UK's total exports and imports by 15% relative to not leaving the EU, according to the Office of Budget Responsibilities calculation. So the UK has to recoup trade losses where the EU incurred by Brexit. on the surface, the tilt from Europe to the Indo-Pacific and using CPTPP to create economic opportunities has a strong rationale, since the region is the world's engine of growth, expected to generate 56% of global growth between 2019 and 2050. However, the potential economic gains from joining the CPTPP look slim. Let me explain in a different way, with a different perspective in comparison to what Erik said. So my point of view, this is mainly because the UK has already had the bilateral FTAs with 7 countries: Canada, Chile, Japan, Mexico, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam out of 11. Although they're what we call continuity agreement that succeed the EU's FTA prior to Brexit, except for Japan, UK FTA. So in addition, the UK has signed the FTA with Australia last December. The FTA with New Zealand is expected to follow. Malaysia and Brunei are likely to be the only 2 countries that have no FTA relation with the UK when the UK joined the CPTPP. And these 2 countries are not yet ratified the CPTPP. So looking at the UK's trade relation with the CPTPP countries, goods exports accounted for 7.99% of UK's total exports, among which 5.99% are to the countries which the UK has already have an FTA. That's a figure is in 2019. In the case of services, 9% of UK's total exports went to the CPTPP, among which 6.2% were to the country with the FTA, with the bilateral FTA relations. As for goods imports, 5.6% out of 7% from the CPTPP countries with the FTA relations. As for services imports, 6.3% out of 7.9%. So note that these figures do not include Australia and New Zealand. So if these 2 countries included, this share will become slightly higher. So among the CPTPP member countries, UK's major trade partners are Canada, Japan, Australia, and Singapore. So the 4 countries account for 87% of services exports, 80% of goods exports, and 84% of services imports, and 75% of goods imports. As I said, with those countries, the UK already has an FTA relationship. And Australia, the relation with Australia is coming soon. So it is true the main benefit of UK joining CPTPP is that it offers unified rules that apply to 11 members. This is a great advantage for business. For example, the CPTPP's rule of origin arrangement is fairly generous, as it allows for the full accumulation of inputs from the CPTPP partner countries. However, as Erik said, the empirical evidence showed that the effectiveness of trade agreement in increasing trade, such as exporting, importing intermediate inputs, is lower for more distant partners. So even that UK's expectation for economic opportunity is so high, given that the UK already has bilateral FTA relation with most of the CPTPP countries, economic benefits look slim. So these imply that the value of UK's joining CPTPP is actually more about geopolitical strategy in a wider context of foreign policy. So what are the main challenges for the UK when applying to join the CPTPP? The CPTPP rules strongly reflect UK's US interests at the Obama administration led the negotiation for the TPP. So UK's joining the CPTPP can be seen as a symbolic strategy move away from the EU's regulatory model for the UK. The main challenge for the UK to join the CPTPP would be potential social impact of such a strategic choice. So to join the CPTPP, the UK in principle has to accept all its rules, existing rules. But it is difficult for the UK to take all of the Asia-Pacific style trade rules. Regulatory divergence from the EU's regulatory regime in order to meet CPTPP's rule may endanger public trust in this regard. So one example is digital trade. So promoting free cross-border data flow with the CPTPP member countries would serve innovation and create new business opportunities. But policy and operational mechanism to maintain the UK's current high standard data privacy protection based on GDPR with the CPTPP members that have a different level of domestic data privacy law is not clear. So this casts the two challenges. The first challenge is its impact on EU's adequacy decision to the UK. So it should be noted that among the CPTPP countries, only Canada, Japan, and New Zealand have received adequacy decision from the EU. Also, the EU's adequacy decision to the UK has a 4-year sunset clause. The second challenge is such move might endanger British citizens' data privacy. Apparently, non-business stakeholders, such as British Consumer Organization, express a strong concern on how British citizens' data privacy is secured. So another example is how to maintain current level of protection in food standards and safety. So because I don't have so much time, I don't want to explain in detail. Well, maybe I can come back to this point later. And then, so the second issue is the UK's joining the CPTPP, implication on Japan. For Japan, UK's joining the CPTPP is strategically an important move. So since the UK withdrew from the TPP, Japan vigorously initiated to conclude the TPP-1, that is a CPTPP. To understand the rationale behind, we have to understand how Japan established its position in international trade. So Japan has been a strong supporter of the multilateral trading system for decades. Through the GATT system to the WTO system, Japan could shift its position from a rule taker to a rule maker. So given that the WTO became malfunctioned and its existence has been threatened from the early 2000s, Japan needed a mega free trade framework through which it can achieve its political and economic interests in global trade. So Japan expects the CPTPP's potential power to set in the rule for international trade. Thus, enlargement is absolutely meets Japan's expectation to strengthen the club. Currently, the Japan is a currently the CPTPP is a regional club of the like-minded countries that promote free trade. By UK's joining CPTPP, the club becomes beyond regional and becomes middle power club that defend free trade. So this opened the horizon for Japan to be global. So which will be welcoming, this will be the, the open the horizon to be global. This is very, welcoming for Japan. The other important point relates to its geopolitical strategy. Having been exposed to economic and political challenges posed by China, which is its 21st century superpower that stands on state-led economy at the next door, it's very important for Japan to embed market economy, free trade, and democracy as common values of world trade. As Obama administration's tactic was cementing the US presence in the Asia-Pacific by promoting high-level regional trade agreement based on free trade and democracy to surround China, Japan expects to grow the CPTPP as a club that can share the values. From this perspective, the UK, the country which has been a front runner of free trade, market economy, and democracy, is exactly the right partner for Japan. So this is why Japan has been enthusiastically endorsing UK to join the CPTPP. So what is the challenge for Japan? Having said that, so I do not think that accession would not be straightforward. The CPTPP accession rules clearly sets compliance with all of the existing rules as a condition. Japan has emphasized its position using several important occasions that compliance with all of existing rules in the CPTPP without exception as a condition of UK's accession. As I explained, maintaining the high-level rule is necessary to make the CPTPP as a global club of free trade. Since the UK is the first acceding country to the CPTPP, and then the UK is open economy, and then it is going to be the second largest economy within the UK, within the CPTPP once it joins, Japan thinks that any exceptions cannot be allowed for the UK. So Japan's position must be further strengthened by China's application to join the CPTPP. If the CPTPP members allow political accommodation for the UK, it would trigger a race to bottom for future accession. And the high standard CPTPP rules will be endangered and then lose substance like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which is a shallow FTA, and which China is a member. On the other hand, Japan expects the UK to be the first member of the club as scheduled, expected by 2022, according to the trade officials. So because of China's willingness to join the club, Japan wants to strengthen CPTPP as a club of promoting free trade and open society and demonstrate that capitalism works for all by joining the UK. So thus, I observe that the major challenge for Japan is to what extent it can accept UK's demand for flexible derogation from the CPTPP rules. Thank you. I stop here.
Well, thank you, Minako. I think, as you rightly explained, that the fact that the UK is the first one to apply is extremely important. And the way the application will be dealt with is absolutely key, because it will set an example. And if there are exceptions granted to the UK, well, of course, it will open the door for other countries that may be interested in joining to take advantage of these exceptions and push for other exceptions. So I think that the importance of the UK being the first acceding country cannot be overstated. It is extremely, extremely important. It will set the tone for the others. And indeed, the fact that China applied after the UK did also changes the game. Okay, well, I may have a couple of questions about the connection between the other FTAs that the UK already has with a number of signatories and the CPTPP, but I'll refrain from asking them now, and I will ask them later on. So now I give the floor to Rohini, who will provide the WTO's perspective, so to speak, and kind of broaden the perspective. So Rohini, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. A Happy New Year to everybody who is participating and who is also observing. I hope very much that 2022 will be an easier year than the last two have been. So my presentation is going to be a little bit of a mixture. So there'll be an overlap between what some of the previous two speakers have already said, and I would be in broad agreement with what they've said, before moving into what might be or what are the potential implications of regional trade agreements, but in a more global manner than specifically the CPTPP on the multilateral trading system. So before I start, it's always useful to put everything in perspective and to show you where we are in terms of regional trade agreements in general that have been notified to the WTO. And so it's a complicated chart, mainly because of our complicated notification procedures, but essentially the important line here is the 353, the black line, which shows you the total number of RTAs that have been notified to the WTO so far and are currently in force. We estimate that there are about between 50 and 100 agreements out there that are in force but have not yet been notified or have not been notified to the WTO. So broadly, the number is potentially much higher. The other thing to point out in this chart is the solid red line, especially for 2021, which is a sharp increase in the number of notifications that we received in that particular year. And that relates mainly to the UK agreements. So these are the bilaterals that the UK notified to the WTO when it left the European Union. And I'll talk a little bit briefly about that also in the context of the CPTPP, as Minako did before me. And this slide simply shows you that everybody is a sinner when it comes to RTAs. Everybody is negotiating or has negotiated. Everybody is a member of several RTAs. And of course, the largest chunk, over a quarter of RTAs, are currently in force for the European region. So that includes the European Union. It now includes the UK. It also includes other parties in Europe, like EFTA, for instance. As you can see, everybody is involved in RTAs. In terms of the CPTPP, as Minako also pointed out, you'll see here on the left, the CPTPP signatories, the ones in bold, are the ones that have already ratified the agreement. Chile, Brunei, and Malaysia have not. Peru has recently ratified the agreement, but was not part of the original signatories to have ratified the CPTPP. In terms of the UK's trade relations with these countries, again, as Minako pointed out, it has free trade agreements, bilateral free trade agreements with almost all of the signatories to the CPTPP. It has recently signed an agreement with Australia, which is still not in force, and is currently negotiating with New Zealand. So the only two that it doesn't have agreements with and is, I believe, not yet negotiating with are Brunei and Malaysia. The CPTPP itself, we looked at this agreement when it was originally notified to us in 2018, I believe. And the key features are, of course, that market access in goods, which liberalize between 65% and 100% of the tariff, 65% being Vietnam and 100% being Singapore and New Zealand. Everybody else ranging themselves somewhere in between these two figures. Market access in services go beyond the GATS, less in certain sectors, notably health, which I think the UK also has a concern about. Accumulation of origin is permitted between the parties, but not with third parties. So there is no diagonal accumulation, for instance. There is a prohibition on import and export restrictions and export taxes. Vietnam, as a developing member, has been given a transition of 15 years to adjust its export taxes. There are some novelties in some chapters like SPS, TBT. There are also transitional or bilateral safeguards up to 3 years after the end of liberalization. Dispute settlement procedures includes ISDS provisions, except for New Zealand, which has side letters excluding ISDS with Australia, Vietnam. And of course, the CPTPP includes a number of issues, provisions that are currently outside the WTO, like environment, labor, e-commerce to some extent, gender, etc. I'll go very quickly through the slide because I think Minako has more or less covered it in terms of the share of trade that already takes place, whether it's under MFN or preferential conditions is not entirely clear to us, because obviously the rules of origin would determine to what extent trade between the parties with which the UK already has bilateral agreements takes place under preferential or MFN rules of origin. In terms of tariff liberalization, this slide shows you the extent to which tariff liberalization has already taken place or is expected to take place under the UK's bilateral agreements with the CPTPP members. So the green part of the chart of the bar shows you whatever is duty-free MFN. So in 2021, what share of the tariff is already duty-free? So in the case of the UK, for instance, approximately 45% of the tariff is duty-free on an MFN basis. The gray part shows you the duty-free what is a duty-free at entry into force under the existing bilateral agreements with the UK. And it's only the dark part of the chart, the dark gray part of the chart that shows you what remains dutiable under the UK's existing bilateral agreements. So in fact, I think the thing to take away from the chart is that the UK has already agreed or committed to substantially liberalize tariffs under the existing bilateral agreements with the CPTPP partners. So I think what I'm getting to is something that has already been said, which is in terms of market access, at least, it's not clear to what extent the UK will make a great benefit, at least on the goods side, from joining this agreement. This again is a chart that's taken from the work that we did on the CPTPP, and it shows you that the others, the existing CPTPP parties are also in a similar situation in the sense that there is not a significant amount of additional liberalization in terms of market access in goods that they've committed to make under the CPTPP either, because most of them also have bilateral agreements in force amongst each other. Chile, for instance, had bilateral agreements in force with all of the CPTPP partners before it joined, before the enlargement of the CPTPP. In terms of services, it's difficult to show you exactly what kind of liberalization has been agreed. But this is again a slide which just shows you in terms of sectoral commitments, to what extent the existing CPTPP parties have either made broader commitments in the sectors to which they already have GATS commitments in, whether they've added new commitments, or in some cases, their commitments are narrower than in the GATS. Now, having said that, what are the potential benefits for the UK? One is, of course, improved market access, which is the main rationale for, well, still the main rationale for most countries forming FTAs with each other. But there I've put in a question mark because it's not entirely clear either on the goods side or on the services side to what extent the UK will really be gaining additional market access, or the CPTPP parties gaining additional market access in the UK's market either. In terms of rules of origin, it is true that there is accumulation between the CPTPP members, and therefore the UK could benefit or would benefit from a larger market in terms of a common set of rules of origin. And there are modernized rules in some areas, SPS, TBT, competition, government procurement, yes and no, SOEs, yes, there are no rules in the WTO on SOEs, so that would definitely be a plus. And there are other rules in areas that are not covered by the WTO, so environment, labor, electronic commerce, competition, SOEs are already mentioned as well. What are the potential challenges or negatives of joining the CPTPP? One is that rules of origin do not include third parties or outward processing. The UK value chains are still linked to the European Union, at least in the short to medium run. And so there will be a certain amount of adjustment that will need to be made, but perhaps this is what the UK is looking for. It's looking for a broadening of its intermediate product markets, for instance. The UK also has defensive issues such as the NHS, pricing of medications. Agriculture is a question mark also, although it remains to be seen what the UK has already agreed with Australia in its FTA and what it's going to agree with New Zealand in its FTA as well. There may be some contradictions in legislation, again, linking legislation that has already linked the UK market to the European Union, such as the European Patent Convention, for instance. And these are issues that were raised by Minako as well. And then one question that has always intrigued us, which is the overlaps in regional trade agreements. We noted that when the CPTPP came into force, that countries like Chile, but also other CPTPP parties already had bilateral agreements with the other CPTP parties. And so the big question for us was, well, what happens to the bilateral arrangements? Will they go? As it turns out, they're not gone. They remain in place. And it's always intrigued us from a WTO perspective on why countries maintain this kind of hodgepodge of several bilateral agreements, layering bilateral agreements one on top of the other. It creates a very, very messy spaghetti ball, if you like. So it's not clear what would happen, what the UK would choose to do, but it's clear that the CPTPP parties so far have decided to maintain their FTAs, their bilateral FTAs, in addition to the CPTPP, which to us would simply mean a complication in terms of the understanding of exporters also, but also customs officials in terms of implementation issues. Now, in terms of the broader issue of regional trade agreements and the WTO, as I mentioned in the first, as I showed in the first slide, this is not a new issue. This has been going on since the formation of the GATT, of course, and there has been a significant increase in the number of regional trade agreements that have been notified to the WTO, especially since the early 1990s. So what is it that we see in terms of what's happening in these two parallel universes? One is, of course, that there is growing divergence. This is something that we would expect because the rationale for negotiating new trading arrangements, new preferential trading arrangements, is that you want better market access than you're able to provide or gain from MFN tariffs. You do the same in services. You want better treatment than GATS, or maybe the status quo that you provide on an MFN basis. So there is growing divergence in terms of market access between what the WTO offers in terms of whether it's the commitments or whether it's the applied rates, the applied regimes, be it in goods or services. But intriguingly, we also find that in other areas, notably trade remedies, and to a large extent, TBT and safeguards, for instance, TBT, SPS and safeguards, there are no significant substantive changes. There may be a few procedural changes, but essentially, RTAs tend to follow the WTO rules in these areas. There are a few exceptions, of course, but by and large, RTAs tend to repeat either repeat what's in the WTO commitments or simply maintain their rights and obligations under the WTO agreements. Finally, in a growing number of areas, there is also growing divergence simply because there are no WTO rules in those areas. And here we have investment, for instance, investment rules that go beyond mode 3 of the GATS, competition, electronic commerce to the extent that it's not covered by the services rules or the ITA, for instance, environment, labor, and I can add other issues, gender, SMEs, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the sort of overall picture that we have, that we've learned from all of the RTAs that have been notified to the WTO thus far. The CPTPP is not an exception, it's simply an addition to what we already know in terms of where RTAs are diverging from the WTO system. There is, however, a silver lining. And I would like to end with that silver lining, and that is that we find common approaches that have been taken. So for instance, the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is now no longer in existence and has been replaced by the USMCA, in contrast to the WTO's GATS which takes a positive list approach to services, decided to start taking a negative list approach to services and investment liberalization. And the UK and the US has generally followed that approach and has built on that approach. Similarly, other countries, mostly in the Asian region, tended to follow the GATS approach and have continued to build upon that GATS approach. So there are sort of common approaches that have been developed and have tended to be maintained by countries. There are also inclusiveness provisions in RTAs. So for instance, you have the European Union's pan-Euromed rules of origin, which try to include a larger number of countries in its rules of origin, thereby giving it market access, thereby giving them market access to each other's economies. There are also accession clauses in a number of RTAs. So the CPTPP itself is an enlargement of an existing RTA, or yes, it continues to exist, which is the Trans-Pacific Closer Economic Partnership, or the P4 as they call it. It originally had 4 members. There are also provisions that are negotiated in RTAs on a bilateral basis. So for instance, legislative changes, competition laws, for instance, countries often negotiate in their RTAs that they will put in place a new competition law, or that they will change their competition laws. For practical purposes, it makes no sense to implement these legislative changes just bilaterally. It makes more sense, it makes practical sense to implement it and apply it to all economic operators in your market. And then for other areas, like for instance, intellectual property rights, the TRIPS agreement of the WTO gives no exception, as the GATT and the GATS do for RTAs. So in other words, if you negotiate a change in your RTA, which agrees to, for instance, extend copyright protection for a certain period of time, you are obliged under the TRIPS agreement to extend that same change to all WTO members. So in this manner, I think what I'm trying to suggest is that to some extent, some of these sort of behind the border provisions are being multilateralized, are being provided in the same manner to all WTO members or all the countries that you trade with, regardless of the fact that you've actually negotiated those changes in a regional trade agreement. Another point to raise is that some issues are simply just too difficult to deal with through RTAs. One example is sensitive products. We see very little movement in terms of additional liberalization of those sensitive products, even in RTAs. Agriculture is a very good example. Some countries are very sensitive about agricultural liberalization and will not liberalize agriculture even in an RTA, and are happy to liberalize the rest. Other issues are simply not applicable bilaterally. You cannot, for instance, many agreements make a commitment to prohibit export subsidies, but it makes little sense to do it bilaterally. It has to be done multilaterally. And so therefore, the negotiations for the agreements such as the trade facilitation agreement, for instance, that was recently negotiated by the WTO, it makes sense only if it is negotiated multilaterally. It makes no sense to have customs procedures on a bilateral basis, or liberalized customs procedures on a bilateral basis. Similarly, the agreement to prohibit export subsidies in the WTO made more sense, in agriculture made more sense than trying to do it on a bilateral basis, which we have found for several years in RTAs anyway. Similarly, it's important to finish the negotiations on fish subsidies, which are currently ongoing in the WTO for a similar reason. There are several RTAs, including USMCA, including the CPTPP, including several other agreements that have recently been negotiated that include specific provisions on fish subsidies. However, again, it makes little sense to do it bilaterally. It makes a lot more sense to do it multilaterally. And I shall stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohini, for ending on a relatively positive note, at least as far as the multilateral trading system is concerned. Well, perhaps a couple of remarks from my side before we open the discussion to the audience. Well, the first one, it seems to me that there is a wide agreement between the three of you about the market access. There is not much to be gained by the UK on this very specific point of market access, both in goods and services, actually. However, it seems to me that there is something to be gained from the other provisions. And the CPTPP is encompasses a number of issues. It is about a number of things. It's about investment. It is about labor standards, environmental standards, etc. There are 30 chapters altogether, so it covers a lot of things. So I would just like to hear from you perhaps a little bit about these other provisions, the gains from these other provisions. You know, market access. Okay, everybody agrees there is not much to be gained. Fine. So what about the rest? So perhaps we should dig a little bit deeper in this direction. And it brings me back to the digital commerce issue. That is something that is very often debated, and it is covered in the CPTPP, and it is very often presented as a major breakthrough. To what extent is that really right? What is exactly in the provisions about digital commerce? From what I read somewhere else, well, digital commerce is part of the CPTPP, but actually the provisions are not that deep. That's what I read here and there. So I don't know. I would like to have your take on that. And it is particularly interesting in the case of the UK. So perhaps some more things about this digital commerce dimension would be of interest. Another thing that makes me react is what you said about the rules of origin. So the rules of origin are uniform. Unified within the CPTPP, but third countries are excluded. Okay, fine. So that creates a problem for the UK, since the value chains are still very much connected to the rest of the EU, and so they have a problem. But you rightly explained that, well, that was perhaps precisely one of the objectives of the UK, to shift away from the EU and to engage in other kind of production processes. Okay, so can we go as far and say that joining the CPTPP was also about providing an incentive to diversify away from the EU? Or is it a little bit exaggerated? So what do you think of this point? The UK is trying to diversify away from the EU, and the CPTPP is precisely a help, a support for this move. Everybody knows that RTAs are very often used as external pressure to facilitate some reform or pushing some reforms. So that may be one example of such a strategy. So I would like to have your reaction on that. And a third slight remarks, I agree with you, Rohini. That's something that I personally never understand. Why is it that countries pile up so many RTAs? They already have bilateral RTAs, and they also engage in regional FTAs. So not only with one single country or individual countries, but with a group of countries. But within this group of countries, there are already bilateral RTAs which covered the trade. So I don't quite get that. I agree with you. It's a bit funny. And on top of that, the bilateral FTAs don't go. They're still there. So they coexist together with the original trading arrangements. And it creates really a mess. So officially, the point of having RTAs is often to do away with spaghetti ball effects, but actually it adds more spaghettis on the plate. And so this is something I don't quite understand. If the two others have something to add on that or to explain, I'd be happy to hear your reaction on that. Okay, these are very uncoordinated and messy reactions on my part. So I would like to have your own reactions to my reactions before we open the discussion to the audience. So who wants to react? I see Minako nodding. So Minako, please don't hesitate.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Françoise. It's very comprehensive question. Maybe I will just answer just those 3 points from me. The first thing is about beside market access, what are the benefits? And then as there are 3 points here. So the first is digital trade provisions. As you rightly said, CPTPP's electronic commerce chapter is not so ambitious anymore, because the digital trade agreements such as the Singapore, Australia digital economy agreement, and also the other digital economy agreements that are already there. But the point I'd like to make is now that digital trade governance is led by the Asian Pacific middle power countries. And then so then the UK would like to be, the implication that the UK would like to be a champion of digital trade. This is clearly mentioned. This is one of the ambition of the UK's FTA project. Also but the problem is that, yes, the CPTPP is not so comprehensive as in comparison with other existing digital trade agreement in the Asia Pacific region. But the very interesting to say, the current, just recently, the UK has concluded the FTA with Australia. And I went through the agreement and I found very comprehensive, ambitious digital trade chapter in it. So this is based on the Australia-Singapore DEA, Digital Economic Agreement. So that for UK, accepting the CPTPP's chapter on digital trade is very easy. But on the other hand, as I said, the problem is that when we look at it globally, there's a divergence of digital trade agreement. Also, the different level of the development, the culture, its approach is very much diversified. And then coming from the EU's, digital trade governance, then the GDPR and others, the UK has a very high standard of the regulation. And then in comparison with the CPTPP countries, this is something the UK has to maintain that standard, but when try to achieve free data, flow, very difficult to have a kind of interoperability of the going to be technical, but in terms of policy and also the mechanism in practice. So this is still not yet solved. This is why I said making the rule, joining the rule is easy for the UK, but implication to the domestic, the policy area is very serious, and then cast doubt and then growing concern on it. And the second thing is investment chapter, as I said. Well, this is one of the, I didn't mention, but one of the problem is the UK will not be able to accept ISDS. Investor state dispute settlement. And then now this is really the area globally that the countries, governments are reviewing the system, ISDS system, that we haven't seen where to go. And then so until the UK itself hasn't established its position yet. So they want to maybe exclude ISDS using the sort of, we call it side letters, but I'm not sure to what extent that maybe ISDS in many CPTP countries are using side letters to exclude the system bilaterally. So might be possible, might not be possible. So this is the kind of gray area. And then the benefits of the, the other provision beside the market access is, as I said, this is the CPTP is very comprehensive, which concludes, as Rohini said, well, that it includes labor, environment, and which the WTO does not cover currently. So that means in that way, the UK can promote its core value of the 21st century trade policy together with CPTPP countries. That is the main major benefit, especially as now the UK British citizen has very strong, the interest or kind of promoting sustainability. And so from the political perspective, promoting sustainability, environment sustainability, using the FTA is a kind of the selling point for the UK government point of view. And so then the second point is about that divergence from the EU. So then, when we look at it from the UK's perspective, the UK has mostly what it has is a continuity, what we call the continuity agreement, which just copy the FTAs, EU's FTAs. And only so far the UK, Japan, CEPA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, is a kind of the agreement based on the EU, but slightly modified. That's actually only the part of digital trade agreement and some part of financial services. And then the Australia, UK was negotiated from scratch. So this is going to be the new FTA, real FTA for the UK on its own. But the thing is, this UK's journey of the FTA journey of shifting from the EU's regulatory trade governance to the Asian Pacific style trade governance may have a conflict because of the Asian Pacific style regulatory principle are different from the EU style regulatory principle. So this is, and then I'd like to say deep FTAs is comprehensive, and it's not only the economic impact, but also societal impact. And so this is going to be the challenges for the UK. Thank you. So I just leave to the others.
Thank you. Erik, do you want to add something? Mute yourself.
Yes. Yeah, no, two things. I mean, first of all, about the WTO plus provisions. I mean, there, of course, I mean, I think it could be playing in the advantage of the UK. And so, if it wants to adhere to those kind of new types of regulations that go beyond the WTO, I think that could be sort of seen as a sort of a regulatory advantage. But then again, I also wonder, what about the other countries that potentially could join the agreement? Because how, for example, would like a country like China, if it wants to really join it, is going to successfully join, would that sort of big market, that would make the CPTPP a lot more important? I mean, are they willing then to also adhere to these kind of WTO plus provisions? And I think there is an area of tension there. So I wonder how that plays out. And that, of course, goes back to the remark that was made before, how strong will the accession procedure and the conditions be for the UK? I mean, if it sets a precedent to find somewhere exceptions, that's, an opening sort of door for other countries to make also exceptions. And I precisely would see that happening there. Another issue is about the e-commerce project, and related to that with the data flows. I mean, back in the days, I think there was, of course, this commitment to have the free flow of information, as they would call it, in the CPTPP, and not to have any kind of localization conditions involved. But again, I mean, yeah, what I also hear and read is that these provisions might not be as strong as one like them to be. But I think there's an additional issue going on here as well when we talk about, the free flow of data, the free flow of information, is precisely the privacy issue. And I mean, I just also wonder in that regard, like how the UK is going to play this out, because on the one hand, it wants to have this sort of new regulatory wedge, you know, compared to the EU market. The EU has the GDPR. And so, you know, you could say, well, in that sense, the UK could sort of, you know, diverge in some way or another to make it sort of the best standards, as, you know, the UK public service or its minister for in this area is always saying. But on the other hand, it has received the adequacy decision. So somehow it needs to adhere when it deals with EU countries to those kind of privacy standards. Japan is a country that has that as well and was prepared to change a couple of laws inside its domestic jurisdiction. But then again, you have other countries inside the CPTPP that has completely different ideas about this issue, about this area. So I always wonder then how that will play out for the UK. I see there is a second area of attention there regarding the issue of data privacy. The more so when you think about other countries, such as China again, in order to join the CPTPP, or CPTPP. So I don't think I think there's a couple of really difficult issues for the UK here to solve, and I see a big area of tension there as well.
Thank you. Rohini, any reactions to the reactions, or is it okay with you and we can move on to the other questions?
No, just one quick comment and one my own opinion on your last point. Quick comment was really about your question about e-commerce and whether it's really high standard or low standard or whatever. Yes, it's true that a number of CPTPP parties have sort of broken away and have signed their own digital agreements after having completed the CPTPP. But at the time the CPTPP was negotiated, it was considered to be a very high standard in terms of electronic commerce. Now, this was negotiated in 2016, 17, 15 even. So a lot of time has passed, and obviously it's a very fast moving
we are losing you.
Area, and therefore countries have then since decided. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Well, there, yeah, on and off.
Okay, very strange. And then on your comment about bilateral RTAs and the fact that there is this overlap, I don't really have an answer to it, but my understanding from discussing this informally is that many countries tend to keep them simply because they want to give the choice to exporters, because the rules of origin may be different under different agreements, and in that case, depending on what kind of rules of origin you already adhere to, you may prefer to use the older agreement rather than the new one. So thank you.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, it doesn't make things easier. Actually, it just makes things messier. Minako, you want to add?
Yeah, just according to the point was raised by Rohini that responded to your question, Françoise, so about this messy situation, spaghetti ball situation with the bilateral and the regional and so on. And actually, I heard from many policymakers that that business really scream, you know, they too complicated and too confusing, and then the country, for example, South Korea, they have many FTAs, but the business gets so confused, and so then how to just sort out this messy situation is not currently becoming the big, you know, issues. And from that perspective, I think it's for the long term, of course, well, the ideal world will be multilateralized, or the multilateral system is really the core. But this is there's so many still the, you know, stumbling blocks there. But this is why we say the multilateral system is ideal. As Rohini said, I completely agree with you.
Yeah, right. It's true that if you cannot go as far as multilateral, minilateral is already better than bilateral. I mean, it's less messy, but I understand that there may be inertia, there may be habits, and so people are used to using one specific arrangement, and it's too tricky for them to move to another one. Well, anyway, okay, so perhaps we'll move into the questions from the audience, and interestingly, many questions are about further enlargement of the CPTPP. So one first question is about the EU's potential accession to the CPTPP. And the question refers to a study published by the European Council on Foreign Relations, but I must say that personally, I also advocated for the EU perhaps not joining the CPTPP, but getting closer to it, or at least keeping an eye on it, and perhaps engaging in negotiations. So what do you think about the EU joining, potentially joining at some point the CPTPP? Do you think it's desirable? And do you think it's feasible? So what's your take on that? Well, I have my own position, and I said that my position is relatively positive, even though it will be extremely complicated. So who says what on this specific issue? Any reactions? Erik?
I mean, my first sort of counter question would be, I mean, desirable, that's a funny, that's a funny, interesting question. I mean, but my sort of reaction would be from a political perspective or from an economic perspective. And if I may allow from my own background, from economic perspective, I mean, you know, the EU is a big market and stuff is going to happen in Asia. So, you know, why not, I would say. I mean, multilateralism doesn't really work so far as we would have liked it to be. And so if the EU wants to join that region with, you know, high standards and creating a bigger market, and also maybe connecting, you know, the regional supply chains somehow, you know, with each other, making these transaction costs low, why not? And, you know, I mean, the study that was made by the center, I mean, it must have thought about the strategic political implications. So in that sense, you know, from a political perspective, maybe that's also desirable. What I find interesting here is that, so what does that mean for the UK then? I mean, the UK, I mean, you know, has this Brexit, wants to have that sort of wedge, what I would always call, or sort of, you know, thinks that it has this sort of regulatory freedom to go further and creating more trade in that sense. I mean, you know, if the EU joins that sort of standard setting group, 11-party agreement, some of that, you know, some of that wedge might sort of be on par what precisely the UK already had with the EU. And so if it tries to go away from that, I mean, somehow, you know, you can see that there's some kind of force that goes back, or that some of the regulatory advantages that the UK thought it had might sort of disappear, I could imagine. So in that sense, I mean, I find that very interesting for the UK. The other thing that I also noted there in terms of EU joining the CPTPP. So, and there I think in what stage and then when? I mean, before China is going to join the CPTPP or afterwards? Because I think that makes a big difference. And particularly with new areas in terms of services or digital trade, like let me say like about digital trade, because if you see what China has done, for example, with another agreement, the RCEP, so, you know, I mean, it has a habit then sort of to negotiate big exceptions. And so if that is something that will also be done for the CPTPP, and then afterwards, the EU is going to join the CPTPP on the basis of maybe further exceptions or similar exceptions, or so then in that sense, I wonder from an economic point of view, how meaningful will that be then, you know, from the pure trade benefits? Strategically, you know, there might be some other benefits involved, you know, from an international political economy perspective. But if these exceptions are very large, I mean, yeah, so a question mark there, I think.
Well, I have no clue, and I'm not part of the CPTPP group. So my understanding is that the CPTPP members really want to push all the others that may be willing to join to abide by all rules. So my understanding is that there should not be exceptions, but we'll see with the UK whether they stick to their guns or not. And that's why I really see this first accession as setting a precedent and as a very important case. And if they really stick to their guns and impose all rules on the acceding country, then the next one who wants to also join will have to do exactly the same thing. So good luck for China.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that, I think that will be very, very important, I think, to precisely create that benefit if potentially other countries like the EU is going to join. Because if that's not the case, I can see that bigger markets will also try to make the exception, and then the trade benefits will sort of water down. So, yeah. Yeah,
but if you start indenting and encroaching on the arrangement, then the arrangement will go nowhere. So, Minako, you want to add something on that?
Yes, thank you. I haven't read the EU Council's report. I will be very much looking forward to read that. And so the argument, well, the similar argument of the UK's joining CPTPP applied to the EU's joining the CPTPP, and then more to the higher extent. I mean, in terms of the strategic point of view, I think it's now the EU is also looking at Indo-Pacific, and then they almost similar to the kind of Indo-Pacific tilt. And I can see that all of these are ambitious geostrategical policy from the EU. So from that point of view, yes, well, why not, if you want? And then from the economic perspective, well, actually the EU has bilateral FTA with almost all the CPTPP countries. And then, as you know, the EU is strong, has a very strong negotiating power with the size of the market. It's not like UK, now the independent. So the big power. And then always EU stress its interest to the FTA partner. So it's not the EU which can compromise, but always the EU's trade partner who has to compromise. And then so the point is that devil's always in detail in the trade negotiation. And then can the EU compromise all of these interests to accept the CPTPP rules, which is very much different from the EU's FTA. And I don't think it's possible. And then a la carte cannot be, I think it's, if a la carte of EU's expectation or modify in terms of the CPTPP, and the CPTPP will be collapsed. So then what's the point in terms of the substance? So is it realistic? I don't think so, because I'm a trade policy expert point of view. I can't see that the EU can fit the current CPTPP rules.
Yeah, so we agree on this one. So Minako, you said that Japan is quite enthusiastic about UK's application to the CPTPP. It's been supporting the application quite forcefully. What about a potential EU application? Do you think Japan would be in favor of this application? That may be pure speculation. What do you think? There is a question relating to this very specific issue.
Yes. From the broad perspective, I think, yes, Japan will appreciate it, because this is maybe because to strengthen the CPTPP and make a global hub or a global club, that the EU is if the US does not join, the EU is really in theory, if the EU joins, that is going to be very influential, and then that would activate the kind of trigger US to just, oh, maybe I should join now. So this is a kind of the, more kind of consequences of the who will come first, who will come next. But the EU is the major power of the global economy. So then Japan will be accepted as a position. But as I said, and then in detail, well, wait a minute. Can the EU, how many demand the EU will put? And then the accession process will not be easy.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there is a further question about the negotiations of the current negotiations ongoing with the UK. And the question is about when will this end? What, from my understanding, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, from my understanding, there is no set procedure precisely for the negotiation. So, and again, this is why this precedent is so important. So I don't know, do you know more about that? Do you know better than I do about this, the way the application is being processed? I don't think that there is a specific deadline for that. I mean, it is under discussion and then, so am I right or wrong on that?
If I may just explain, the CPT has a precise rule on the accession procedures, but in terms of the time frame, there is no definition. So it's going to be long, it's going to be short, but the thing is they have to first of all accept all rules, and then once accepting all rules, then the market access negotiation start. That is go through the bilateral negotiation one by one with the CPTPP, each CPTPP members. So then the UK expected to join by the end of 2022, but maybe the UK will be the easiest case for the CPTPP accession, and but no secretariat for the CPTPP. So it's really still unprecedented.
Yeah, So there may be a procedure, but there is no specific timeline. Okay, and any idea about the UK's attitude towards China's accession? Well, I guess the UK is quite busy negotiating its own accession, so I don't know whether they have a specific view. Erik, do you have any idea about that, where the UK would be favorable or not? It's a Chinese participant asking this question. So
no, economically, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the British sort of policymakers would like to have China to join, because then it means also that they have a larger export market, and that plays in their favor for sure. And I think that's very much what they want and what they're in search for. Yeah, I think also it depends a bit on the sort of political aspect, how easy it will be for China to join the CPTPP. But I think in principle, it's what they want. And I think as soon as a big country like China will join the CPTPP, it makes the CPTPP much more meaningful.
Yeah, right. Well, there is a question about if ever, this is pure science fiction, okay? But assuming China joins the CPTPP, the question goes, will it be able to block the possible candidacy of the US to join? Well, my response would be yes, since, if I understand properly, in order to allow a further country to join the CPTPP, all signatories have to agree. So any country should be able to join. Again, do I get that right or wrong? Any idea? From what we see with the case of the UK, all signatories have to agree with the UK's accession. So I guess the rule is that all signatories have to agree with further accessions. So in this case, if ever China is in, China should be able to block further accessions. But really, this is a huge if. It's not a big if, it's a huge if. Assuming China is in. I don't think this will be tomorrow, but anyway. Well, an interesting question is about the UK, what happens in the UK right now? So this is, I guess, both for Minako and Erik. Well, is there strong support in the UK for this negotiation? From a political perspective, UK domestic political perspective, is there wide support for this negotiation, or nobody cares anyway? So is this viewed as a consistent strategy in combination with other bilateral policies? Any idea of that? Yeah, Minako?
Yes. So what the wide support or not? Well, actually, FTA, this post-Brexit, independent trade policy, that's the CPTPP is the one of the major, the strategy of the objective for the UK government. And then Well, I think that in general, the public support, the going close to the Asia Pacific, but on a daily basis, nobody really cannot pay attention under the current auto situation of COVID-19, and then also the very detrimental EU's UK trade, and so business is really struggling coping with all of these, uncertainty. Then, as I said, well, the public, the non-business stakeholders have concern on the different regulatory framework, shifting to the regulatory framework. So the situation is very mixed, but I think in general, supportive. But what will be once accessed in the world, that the price to pay is not, people do not understand. That's the current situation.
Yeah, I mean, the public support. Yeah, no, so public support. I mean, again, it is just sort of thinking off the cuff, and I think where sort of it might be more difficult for the public in the UK to accept the CPTPP is, I think, whether, again, China will join or not. And that has to do, I think, with the WTO plus provisions, because if there is any difficulties there, is a country like China willing to join higher standards that go beyond trade, like in terms of labor, for example, and the environment? Because these are issues that are becoming more and more important for, I think in particular countries like the UK. And so will a important country like China adhere to these kind of standards that are higher? And so, and what I do see and read and follow is that the UK politicians at least find it important. And so, I think that is an area where I think the public acceptance by having the CPTPP in place is might be difficult there.
Okay, well, we're getting to the end of the session. Perhaps I would like to leave Rohini couple of minutes, perhaps, to conclude. Well, my question is, does the WTO actually follow the negotiations closely? Is the WTO concerned with this kind of new type RTAs, FTAs, minilateral agreements, whatever you want to call them? Is it a concern for the WTO as an institution dealing with trade rules? So do you have something to say about that, or isn't it a concern at all? I mean, you have your own turf, you know that you still have a lot of, of work to do, and so you don't really care.
No, we do, first of all, we do try and follow the negotiations to the extent that we're able to. I mean, RTA negotiations take place outside the WTO in any case. So it's, I know as much about it as you do probably when they're taking place. But we do follow negotiations. Whether it's a concern or not, yes, obviously it is a concern. It's always been a concern. The fact that the CPTPP entered into force, I would argue, is not, well, yes, it is perhaps more of a concern because of the nature of the agreement. But the fact that, the fact that RTAs have always been part of the system, or a parallel system, if you like, did lead to members expressing concern and establishing the Committee on Regional Trade Agreements in the mid-1980s. So this has been an issue that the WTO is interested in from a systemic perspective. The committee was established specifically to examine all RTAs that are notified to the WTO. And also to look at issues of systemic concern being namely the rise in the number of regional trade agreements and the multilateral trading system. So yes, it's always been an issue of concern, and the fact that there was a committee created for it demonstrates that members did have that concern. Now, the RTAs are also part of the current round of negotiations. So there is concern that there are these diverging rules, and members need to look at these issues to try and find out or figure out how best to improve the WTO rules so that some of these issues can be captured in terms of consistency. Now, those negotiations, given the size of the membership, given the diversity of the membership, have progressed slowly. We have a new transparency mechanism in force since 1996, which basically puts all RTAs that are notified to the WTO on a level playing field, and we are supposed to provide the same kind of documentation to the membership. And we have now a better understanding of what these RTAs are including in terms of the provisions. So it's a sort of very slow step-by-step approach. But in terms of consistency assessment, the membership, yes, does need to be a little bit stronger in terms of where they take the negotiations on regional trade agreements. So yes and no, it is a concern. It is a concern. It has always been a concern. Whether the membership does anything about it, of course, is a different issue. And given the diversity of the membership, that is harder. That is getting harder.
Well, thank you for this very comprehensive response. Well, time is running out, so we have to put an end to this very interesting conversation. So thank you. Thanks to all three of you for this very interesting discussion. And I guess we have to keep an eye on the negotiation to see whether the UK finally joins the CPTPP and whether further candidates also get their way to the CPTPP. China is a candidate, but so is Taiwan, which also makes things quite complicated. And the next in line, if I understand properly, will be Korea. Korea has expressed interest and already announced officially that it will formally apply. With Korea, everything is always very slow. And so they have announced that they will apply formally before the end of April, if I understand properly. So South Korea will be the next in line. So we have to keep an eye on all these various accession processes to see whether the CPTPP becomes still bigger, and whether it is really becomes a new forum where rules are being set. So thank you again for both the speakers and the attendance, and well, hope to see you soon to further discuss this kind of issues. Yeah, bye-bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.